You might be asking yourself, why is society such a mess? Leftists often claim that it's capitalism or the patriarchy. But BlazeTV host Auron MacIntyre has a different diagnosis: liberty without virtue. Auron joins us now to discuss this. So Auron, let's dive right into this. What do you mean by liberty without virtue?
Well, in the United States, we often learn that freedom is the core of who we are, right? But a lot of people looking at a drug addict who's free to do as much heroin as they'd like understands that ultimately that person isn't really operating under liberty. They don't really understand. They're not really in control of who they are. They are a slave to their own desires. And so when we think about liberty, when we think about freedom, it's better to understand that ordered liberty, liberty that is pursuing a specific type of virtue, is ultimately what we're aiming for. And that's really what our founding fathers understood, that it's not liberty by itself, but it is the freedom, the liberty to pursue the good life in a shared moral vision that ultimately is what brings us together as Americans.
Auron, couldn't agree with you more. You stumbled into the hidden recesses of my mind 3 lifetimes ago in a dissertation chapter I wrote on liberty versus licentiousness in the ratification debates.
It's about to get good.
And I really like the way you laid this out. It feels to me that I really want to get into it. It feels to me that conservatives used to understand this, or that this was sort of common knowledge. Like, if freedom just means freedom to do whatever I want, then we're going to be in a pretty bad way pretty quick. Why do you think we've forgotten this?
Well, I think especially in a more libertarian age, it was easier to sell the right as the party of freedom, the Republicans, the right. We were the people who were looking for free speech, freedom of action. And that was the constant shelling point. But ultimately, that's not a great place to be because, as you said, really, this just ends up having us turn to licentiousness. When people are only pursuing freedom, then they may be free to, again, do drugs or seek whatever kind of sexual perversion they prefer. And they don't really understand that freedom was only really ever a benefit to a people who are working towards a common goal. I think more religious Americans understood this. They understood that while they may have a liberty from government oversight, that liberty only exists because they were pursuing a path of righteousness towards a religious goal, following the laws that God had set before them. But when we just use freedom to mean whatever we want to pursue, we very quickly fall into these terrible places where the country falls apart, because while we're free to pursue the things that we now desire, ultimately these things dissolve the social fabric that was holding us together without the government.
Before we move any further, let's have you define virtue in the context of maintaining a free society.
Well, Aristotle believed that we could only really pursue virtue in communities. Communities are places where we interact with others and we fulfill the roles that we are meant to embody. And so when we're pursuing virtue, we're trying to become the best instantiation of those ways of being, understanding that our roles as fathers or husbands or mothers or children, members of communities, churches, friends, these things all matter. And it's only when we are pursuing those goals as our liberty that we really fulfill it. And ultimately, what we need to do is recognize the best way to be a father, to be a wife, to be a member of a church. And that's often what we have to sacrifice other desires for, even though we technically have the freedom to pursue them.
Let me throw in there. So the old school definition in Noah Webster's dictionary for licentiousness, it was a contempt for just restraint. So in other words, there are certain, it's exactly to your point, there are certain restraints that are just, that help us, just like, a wall helps us, we can do exercises off the wall or the floor, that justice guides us down this path to establish these habits that make us ultimately happy. I want to read you something and just have you respond to it. This is a George Washington, in one of his fine moments after the Revolution, is circular to the states before he goes back to the farm after the Revolution. And he says that there's a natural and necessary progression from the extreme of anarchy to the extreme of tyranny, and that arbitrary power is most easily established on the ruins of liberty abused to licentiousness.
Yeah, that's a great quote. That's really him understanding that once we realize we have this liberty, once we realize the government is not lording over us every moment, we have to maintain that path of virtue, because when we step off it for our own ends, when we decide that, well, yes, I do have this freedom mainly so I can pursue the good, but what if this time I just pursued what I would like best, what feels good in the moment? Once we do this, we start moving towards anarchy. And when we enter that state of anarchy, only someone with a large amount of power can really right the ship. I actually point out in my essay that Machiavelli is somebody who talked a lot about this, that when you have this moment where order has fallen apart because the people have become no longer virtuous, really you end up in a moment where a Caesar or a king must right the ship. You only end up with this republican virtue after order has been restored. And so if we fall off this path, if we fail to fulfill our roles, our virtuous roles in the community, then the government must step in. And often that's the left's plan, to enable this licentiousness, not because they actually want us to be free to pursue something that would make us happy, which ultimately it doesn't, but more because they want to centralize government power. And they recognize that every time we become less virtuous, we become more reliant on the government to fill in those roles.
So he's throwing out George Washington. You're talking about Machiavellian things. Are there any current figures? Can we bring this in to 2024 that embody any of these virtues, or are we just completely lost?
Well, I'm sure we can think of different virtues that we would appreciate. There are many great religious men still around today. There are, of course, business leaders and politicians. But ultimately, this is really something that has to be created across the population. Again, the thing that brings that threshold of virtue to the point where we can maintain a republic is that it is part of our general religious understanding, our general tradition. If this is just one or two people, it doesn't really do what we needed to do. Perhaps those people can be the kings that we were talking about. That's not really what a lot of people are looking for. They're hoping to maintain that Republican form of government. And as John Adams told us, the Constitution is really only good for a moral and religious people. It doesn't work for any other. So this wouldn't have been alien to the founding fathers. They were a set of people who broke away from England, from having a king, but only after they had established a level of order and virtue inside the United States that would allow for that governance. And they knew that if they lost that, if we were relying entirely on the virtue of a couple of people instead of inculcation across the populace, that ultimately we would become the subjects of those people.
Amen to that. So if you have a king and they go wrong, I mean, that's the problem with monarchy. What happens when the king goes wrong? Becomes evil. Problem of aristocracy. What happens when the few go wrong? And as you point out here, the founders understood what happens when the many go wrong. The majority in a republic, you lose the form of government, and ultimately it leads towards tyranny. So you say at the end of this article, I find it unlikely that the United States will collectively return to Republican self-governance. But then you advocate for, or you say, there are groups of people who need to come together to do this. Now, to me, that sounds like the only possible way to save the country, to save, the whole republic, would be that people do come together and start to reestablish this sort of virtue. But can you say more about what you mean by this and why you think it's unlikely?
I think at this moment, it's a lot of people are obsessed with freedom, that it is really very difficult to sell the idea that to hold this form of government, something that some people on the right, often conservatives, cherish, but ultimately is something I think the left is largely willing to discard. It's pretty hard to sell them the idea that they need to go ahead and start following some form of Christian virtue, some kind of shared moral vision under Christianity in order to retain that Republican virtue. You can still, I think, have small groups of people. You can still have Christian communities that are pursuing that. And in fact, the point is that whether I'm right or I'm wrong, the answer is still the same. The average person has to right themselves. They have to right their family. They have to become active in their church. They need to expand the influence of that church to their community. And they need to build social organizations built on this virtue, because whether we can bring things together through a revivification of our republic, or whether we have to go our own ways and figure out new forms of social organization, in either instance, inculcating virtue in the next generation is really what's going to guarantee success for those that are doing so.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I encourage you to go read this piece by Auron at theblaze.com. It's incredible. And it's fascinating that we live in a time in which what so many people call freedom is actually something that leads them into slavery.